Two men, same age, same success, same room. One commands quiet respect the moment he speaks. The other tries too hard, and nobody quite knows why it doesn't land. It's not the age. It's not the wrinkles or the gray hair. It's three specific behaviors, and most men never realize they're doing them. Let me show you what they are. Here is the first thing to understand, and it changes everything about how you think about aging and attractiveness once you really absorb it. Age does not make a man unattractive. Insecurity does, and insecurity does not disappear with age, money, or success the way most men assume it will. It simply changes shape, hiding inside behaviors that look like confidence on the surface, but are actually their exact opposite, once you know what to look for. A younger man's insecurity tends to be loud and obvious, easy to spot, and easy to forgive because everyone expects a young man to still be figuring things out. An older man's insecurity is quieter, more sophisticated, dressed up in the language of experience and wisdom, which makes it far harder to recognize both in others and in yourself. The Stoics had a word for what we're really talking about here. Dignity, not performed dignity, not the stiff, controlled version many older men mistake for maturity, the version that looks composed on the outside but is really just suppression wearing a suit. Genuine dignity is something else entirely. It is the kind that comes from a man who has made peace with himself and no longer needs anyone's approval to feel solid in who he is. Seneca wrote extensively about the difference between a man who has mastered himself and a man who has simply grown older without growing wiser, accumulating years the way one accumulates possessions without any of it actually changing him on the inside. Age alone teaches nothing. It only provides more time in which a man either does the inner work or doesn't, and most men, if we're honest, spend that extra time avoiding the work rather than doing it. The three mistakes I'm about to show you are not about age at all. They are about what happens specifically when that inner work has been skipped, regardless of how many years have passed or how much external success has been accumulated along the way. And here is what makes this particularly important for older men specifically. Younger men get a pass on a lot of these behaviors because immaturity is expected and even somewhat endearing at that stage of life. Older men do not get that same grace. The same behavior that reads as nervous and forgivable in a 25-year-old reads as a fundamental character flaw in a man twice that age, which means these three mistakes matter more, not less, as time goes on. Mistake 1, over-explaining and justifying himself constantly. Watch for this pattern because once you see it, you will notice it everywhere. A man is asked a simple question, and instead of answering directly, he gives a long defensive explanation nobody asked for and nobody needed. He over-justifies decisions that require no justification whatsoever. He preempts criticism that hasn't been offered and likely was never going to be offered in the first place. He explains why he's late, why he chose what he chose, why he believes what he believes at a length far beyond what the moment actually requires, turning a simple exchange into an unnecessary defense of his own character. This behavior is almost always rooted in a quiet, often unconscious fear of being judged inadequate, a fear that has typically been present for decades, but has simply found new outlets as the man has aged. And here's the problem with it. The thing most men never realize about their own over-explaining. Over-explaining doesn't prevent judgment, it invites it. When a man over-explains, he signals, without meaning to, that he doesn't fully trust his own decisions or his own standing in the room. And that signal is far more damaging than whatever he was originally worried about being judged for in the first place. The explanation itself becomes the evidence of insecurity, even when the original action needed no defense at all. A man who has done the Stoic work of self-acceptance simply doesn't need to do this. He can say, "I was late, my apologies," and stop there completely, because the explanation isn't where his sense of worth comes from in the first place. His worth was settled long before this particular moment, internally, privately, and it doesn't require external validation through justification to remain intact. The correction here is not complicated in concept, though it does require real discipline to practice consistently. When you catch yourself justifying something nobody questioned, stop mid-sentence if you have to. Let the silence sit, even if it feels uncomfortable at first. A short, direct answer carries far more weight than a long, defensive one ever will. And people respect brevity far more than most men realize, because brevity signals a kind of internal security that no amount of explanation could ever convincingly fake. Mistake 2, competing with younger men instead of standing apart from them. This shows up in obvious and subtle ways, and most men doing it would deny it if asked directly, because it rarely feels like competition from the inside. It feels like staying relevant, staying current, staying connected. But look closer and the competition becomes clear. Trying to match the energy, slang, or interests of much younger people in a way that reads as imitation, rather than genuine engagement. The older man who suddenly adopts language and references that don't fit naturally with who he actually is. Constantly referencing past achievements or status, as if needing to prove continued relevance to people who never asked for that proof. Getting visibly uncomfortable or dismissive when younger. More energetic men are in the room as though their presence is a threat to be managed, rather than simply a different stage of life that has nothing to do with his own worth. Here is what the Stoics understood that applies directly to this exact situation. Comparison is the thief of contentment, a principle Epictetus returned to repeatedly, and a man consumed by comparison can never project the kind of settled presence that is genuinely attractive at any age, in any room, to any audience. The man who competes with younger men is implicitly telling everyone in the room that he believes youth itself is the standard he's being measured against, and worse, that he believes he's losing that particular comparison. Nobody finds that compelling, no matter how it's dressed up or disguised. What is compelling, consistently and reliably, is a man who is clearly settled into exactly who he is at this stage of his life, who doesn't need to borrow relevance from another generation because he has built his own relevance through the accumulated weight of his own experience. The correction here is internal before it ever becomes external, which is exactly why it's harder than it sounds. Stop measuring your value against a younger man's energy, status, or cultural fluency. Measure it instead against the man you were 5 years ago or 10. Have you grown? Are you wiser than you were? Are you calmer under pressure than you used to be? Do you understand things now that you genuinely didn't understand then? That comparison, the only one Stoicism considers worth making, the comparison between your current self and your past self, rather than between yourself and someone living an entirely different chapter of life, is the one that actually matters and the one that actually produces growth rather than anxiety. If this is landing, hit like, because mistake 3 is the one almost nobody recognizes in themselves, even after hearing the first 2 clearly. Mistake 3, reacting emotionally to small inconveniences instead of staying composed. This is the most damaging of the 3, because it's the one most invisible to the man doing it, the one he's least likely to catch in himself even after watching this entire video. A slow waiter, bad traffic on the way somewhere unimportant, a minor disagreement at dinner, someone disagreeing, even gently, with an opinion he holds strongly. Watch how a man responds to these completely ordinary, low-stakes moments that happen dozens of times a week, and you will learn more about his actual character than anything he could ever tell you about himself directly. The man who becomes visibly irritated, who sighs heavily and audibly, who raises his voice slightly without quite realizing he's doing it, who lets his face tighten with frustration over something genuinely minor and forgettable, is revealing something he probably doesn't intend to reveal to anyone watching. He is showing in real time that his internal state is hostage to external circumstances completely outside his control, that his peace of mind can be hijacked by a waiter's pace or a few extra minutes in traffic. And here's why this specifically destroys attractiveness in older men more than it does in younger ones, which is worth understanding clearly. With age comes an implicit, largely unspoken expectation of composure. We forgive a 25-year-old's occasional outburst as immaturity still being worked out, as a young man who simply hasn't had time yet to develop emotional regulation. We do not extend that same grace to a 60-year-old, because by that age, composure is supposed to have been earned through decades of accumulated experience and reflection. When it hasn't been earned, when the reactions are still as immediate and unfiltered as they were 30 years earlier, it reads not as a minor character flaw, but as a fundamental failure of the inner work that age was supposed to have produced along the way. Marcus Aurelius wrote constantly, almost obsessively, about this exact discipline in his private journal, training himself daily to separate events from his reactions to them, understanding clearly that the traffic, the slow waiter, the minor disagreement, none of it has any actual power over his internal state unless he personally grants it that power through his own response. The events themselves are neutral. The suffering comes entirely from the judgment layered on top of them. The correction here is the deepest of the three mistakes, and the one that requires the most genuine, sustained practice, rather than a simple behavioral switch you can flip overnight. The next time something minor and irritating happens, before reacting at all, pause and ask yourself one simple question: will this matter in a week? In almost every single case, the honest answer is no. It will not matter even slightly by then. And that single pause, that brief moment of consciously choosing your response, rather than being automatically controlled by the irritation, is visible to everyone around you in the room, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what they were noticing about you in that moment. Here is what ties all three of these mistakes together, and it's worth sitting with this for a moment because it fundamentally changes how you approach correcting them going forward. Over-explaining, competing with younger men, and reacting emotionally to small inconveniences are not three separate, unrelated problems that each require their own individual fix. They are three different expressions of the exact same root issue: a man whose sense of self is still being constructed externally rather than internally, still dependent on outside validation to feel secure. He needs the explanation to be believed by others. He needs the comparison to feel relevant in the eyes of people around him. He needs control over external circumstances in order to feel calm internally. In every single case, his peace of mind depends entirely on something outside himself cooperating with his expectations. The Stoic correction to all three problems is fundamentally the exact same correction, building an internal foundation solid enough that explanations can comparisons, and circumstances simply stop having the power to shake it, regardless of what happens externally. This is not something you fix overnight through a single insight, and it is not something you fix through willpower alone applied in isolated moments. It is built slowly, gradually, through the daily, often unglamorous practice of noticing these specific patterns the moment they appear, and consciously choosing the quieter, more composed response instead, again and again, until it becomes less of an effort and more of who you actually are. Every time you choose brevity over justification, every time you choose contentment over comparison, every time you choose composure over reaction, you are doing the actual work the Stoics spent their entire lives writing about and practicing themselves. And the result of that work is not something you have to perform or announce to anyone. It shows up automatically, on its own, in the way you carry yourself through a room, in the way a room subtly settles when you finally speak after staying quiet. In the quiet, unforced respect that naturally gravitates toward a man who is genuinely at peace with who he is without needing anyone else to confirm it for him. That is not youth, and it was never going to be youth. That is not charm in the conventional surface level sense either. That is something far rarer and far more attractive at any age, in any room, with any audience, a man who no longer needs the world's permission to feel solid in himself. Thanks for watching. And until next time.